Welcome to the Hodja on Architecture podcast. AI and Architectural Design, Chapter 8, The New Studio, Pedagogy, Process, and AI Integration. In the previous chapter, design thinking was reframed as a site of cultural mediation, where ideas move across contexts and are reshaped through translation. The process was no longer confined to a single framework but unfolded within a network of influences, requiring as much interpretation as generation. But once design becomes hybrid, visible, and culturally mediated, another question inevitably emerges. How should it be taught? If the conditions of thinking have changed, then what happens to the studio itself? The architectural studio has long been the central space of design education. It is not simply a physical environment, but a pedagogical structure. Within it, students develop ideas, test them, and refine them through critique. The studio is organized around dialogue, between student and tutor, between peers, and between ideas and representations. It is a space where thinking becomes externalized through drawings, models, and presentations. This structure has traditionally been based on a sequence. Students begin with a concept, develop it through iterations, and present a final proposal. The process is often documented, but the emphasis tends to remain on the outcome. Critique focuses on what is produced, even when it refers back to the process. The thinking behind the design is inferred rather than directly observed. Artificial intelligence alters this structure by making the process more explicit. As discussed in earlier chapters, AI generates a trace of interaction, prompts, outputs, selections, and revisions. This trace provides a record of how ideas evolve. The studio therefore gains access to a dimension of the design process that was previously difficult to capture. Thinking becomes more visible, and this visibility changes how it can be taught. The role of the tutor in this context begins to shift. Instead of focusing primarily on evaluating outcomes, attention moves towards guiding the process. The tutor engages with the sequence of decisions that lead to the design rather than only with the design itself. Feedback becomes more precise, addressing not only what is presented but also how it has been developed. This does not eliminate the importance of outcomes. The final proposal remains a critical component of design education. However, its role changes. It is no longer the sole indicator of understanding. The process that leads to it becomes equally significant. The ability to articulate decisions, justify directions, and reflect on alternatives becomes central to assessment. For students, this shift requires a different mode of engagement. The design process can no longer remain implicit. It must be documented, structured, and communicated. Prompts, iterations, and selections become part of the work. The student is not only producing a design, but also presenting a trajectory of thinking. This demands a higher level of reflection. At the same time, the integration of AI introduces new challenges. The ease with which images can be generated may lead to an overproduction of outputs without sufficient evaluation. The process may appear active, but it lacks depth. Without a clear framework, students may focus on quantity rather than quality, moving quickly between options without engaging critically with any of them. This is where pedagogy becomes crucial. The integration of AI into the studio cannot be reduced to access to tools. It requires a restructuring of expectations. Students must be guided to engage critically with the process, slow down when necessary, and evaluate their decisions. The emphasis shifts from generating more to understanding better. One way to approach this is through structured reflection. Instead of treating reflection as an additional task, it becomes embedded within the design process. Students are encouraged to articulate why certain decisions are made, how alternatives were considered, and what criteria were used for selection. This transforms the process from a sequence of actions into a sequence of reasoned steps. The studio therefore becomes a space not only for making but also for thinking about making. The presence of AI amplifies this condition. It produces more material for discussion, more decision points, and more opportunities for reflection. The tutor's role is to organize this material into a coherent learning experience. Another important aspect of this shift is the relationship between intuition and analysis. Design has always relied on intuition, the ability to make decisions based on experience and tacit knowledge. With AI, intuition remains important, but it must be accompanied by articulation. The reasons behind intuitive decisions must be expressed and examined. This does not diminish intuition, but situates it within a broader framework of reflection. The integration of AI also affects how students perceive their own role. If outputs can be generated rapidly, the designer's value is no longer confined to production alone. It shifts towards decision making, evaluation, and direction. Students must understand that the quality of their work depends not on the number of images produced, but on the coherence of the process. This has implications for assessment. Traditional criteria that focus on the final presentation may no longer be sufficient. New criteria must be introduced to evaluate the process: the clarity of prompts, the logic of iterations, the justification of decisions, and the ability to reflect on the work. Assessment becomes more complex, but also more aligned with the realities of contemporary design practice. At a broader level, the studio itself begins to transform. It becomes less about individual production and more about shared inquiry. The visibility of the process allows students to learn from each other more effectively. They can observe different approaches, compare decisions, and discuss strategies. The studio becomes a collective space of learning, where thinking is not only individual, but distributed. This transformation does not replace the traditional studio. Drawing, modeling, and physical exploration remain essential. AI does not eliminate these practices, it adds another layer to them. The challenge is to integrate these layers in a way that enhances learning rather than fragmenting it. The studio must remain coherent, even as it becomes more complex. If the previous chapters examined how AI reshapes thinking, authorship, and cultural interaction, this chapter addresses how these changes are translated into pedagogy. The studio becomes the site where these shifts are operationalized. It is where abstract ideas about AI and design are tested, refined, and taught. The question is not whether AI should be included in design education. Its presence is already established. The question is how it should be integrated. Should it be treated as a tool, a method, or a condition? The answer, perhaps, is that it functions as all three, but its most significant impact lies in how it changes the conditions of thinking. In this sense, the new studio is not defined by the presence of AI alone, but by the way it reorganizes the relationship between thinking, making, and teaching. The process becomes more visible, more structured, and more open to discussion. The role of the designer evolves, and so does the role of the educator. In the next chapter, we will move from pedagogy to a broader set of concerns and examine how questions of ethics, authenticity, and originality are reframed in the context of AI-driven design. The discussion will shift from how design is taught to how it is valued, from process to principles. Because once the studio adapts to new conditions of thinking, the next question becomes unavoidable. What counts as authentic design? And how is originality understood when ideas emerge through interaction rather than isolation? This concludes Chapter 8 of AI and Architectural Design, the new studio, pedagogy, process, and AI integration. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.